In today's video, I will be taking a look at my final 2022 Senate election prediction just 4 days away from the midterm elections themselves. So I'm gonna get right into today's video. Now the save states are filled in to save some time, as this video will be much more in-depth and much more interesting. So for the first state is the state of Washington. Washington is not a particularly competitive state, but Patty Murray only has a 8.4% lead according to FiveThirtyEight, a liberal-leaning biased website. Thus, this race will not be that large of a margin. In fact, in polling data itself, Democrats only lead by 6.1 points, down from the 14% margin around August 1st, in which Patty Murray was leading by. So this race will only go into the likely Democratic column. My margins are also in the description down below, just to mention that. Now for the state of Nevada. Nevada only went to Catherine Cortez Masto in 2016 by 2.4%, consequentially the margin that Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton won the state by. And in the Senate election model here, Adam Laxalt is currently slightly advantaged to win against Kevin Cortez Masto. And that is definitely something I would agree with. Looking at the polls, also Nevada in Adam Laxalt has been surging recently. He was down by about 4% around September, and now he is up by 0.6%. Now this is a very close race, but I think that Adam Laxalt has the advantage. Nevada is not that liberal of a state. You have to have a D plus 3 or 4 state for a Democrat to win in a Republican wave. Kevin Cortez Masto is not particularly strong of a candidate, thus I do believe that Nevada will go into the Republican column by about 2 percentage points, or about a lean margin. For the state of Arizona, this state is quite interesting. The polling data here does have Arizona Mark Kelly up by 2%. However, do remember that in his race against Martha McSally, his Democrat-Republican challenger in 2020, he was polling by a lead of about 6% leading into election day, and he only won by 2.4%, a 3.6% polling polls overestimated him by 3.6%. Not exactly the best sign for him. And polling data again has narrowed just like in 2020, except in 2020 the polls only narrowed by about 2% leading up to the election. The polls narrowed down by about 4% in this election cycle, again not a good thing for Mark Kelly. And just look at the polling itself. Kelly, although are pretty much up in every single recent poll, is only by about 1 to 2%, and there are also polls showing it in an even race. Again, not good for the incumbent Mark Kelly, thus I will put this race as a tilt state for the GOP. Now for the state of Colorado. Colorado is widely expected to go to the Democratic Party. This is the governor's, I'm sorry about that. Oops. So for the state of Colorado here, Michael Bennet has about a 91% chance of winning. This is not bad, but for the state of Colorado, Joe Adia is a relatively good candidate for the Republicans, as he is more moderate, and he is not expected to lose by that much. FiveThirtyEight has this race going to Michael Bennet by about 7%, and I do generally agree with that characterization. Michael Bennet was only able to win by 5% in 2016, but the state has trended Democrat since. However, this election cycle is not that friendly for the Democratic Party, and the polling data has not suggested necessarily a very wide race in terms of the margin of about a 10% margin, but this race also is currently narrowing, though Michael Bennet has reached over 50% of the vote. This is still a decent margin for him. I still expect him to win by about 7, but it's not necessarily the best margin for a Democrat in Colorado. For the state of Florida, this also should be a pretty obvious race that the Republicans are winning by. Republicans are leading by 7 in the state of Florida, also a jump from a 4% polling lead back in October. And this is good news for Marco Rubio. Rubio has never actually lost in a poll. He was even in one of these polls, but it was not necessarily the best poll. It was Florida Watcher and Progressive Florida. These are two Democratic internals that were funding the poll. Thus, Marco Rubio definitely has a very, very good chance at winning this election. And Florida currently is rated a state that is Marco Arabia is expected to win by about 10%, which is a characterization I do stand by. Thus, I'll put this race in the likely Republican column. Now for the state of Georgia, which I will go in depth later on because this state is expected to go to runoff by EPA predictions. So I'm gonna go to the next state of North Carolina. North Carolina is rated a likely state on my characterizations. Richard Burr was able to defeat Deborah Ross by about 6% in the last election in the seat 6 years ago. And as you can see, Burr was able to narrow down the Democratic margins in Greensboro, Wake, and Mecklenburg. This is why he was able to win by such a substantial margin for a very competitive state. However, just looking at the polling in the state of North Carolina, it has been a relatively close race, but the margins have expanded over the past month or so. Around October the 1st, Bud was only leading by less than 1%. Now he's leading by over 3 points. Again, the Republican optimism is kind of shifting in the Republicans' favor. Although recent polls have this race slightly more competitive, I still think that Ted Budd should easily win this race, and looking at the 538 Senate forecast, they do support my theory as they give Ted Budd around a 5% margin of lead, and I expect him to win by about 7%. The next state is the state of Ohio. Ohio last time had an incompetitive Senate election as Robert Portland was able to win by over 20% against Ted Strickland. Quite interesting considering Strickland was actually leading some polls in the state of Ohio. The polls were dead wrong in this state. And just looking at the polling this time, Democrats were actually having some hope in this race, given that Tim Ryan was polling as high as 5% above J.D. Vance at one point in this campaign. Now, we all knew that that was not going to happen. But now Vance has opened up his lead to about 3%, just 5 days away from the election cycle. Thus, I do believe that he should be able to easily win against Ted Budd, as Ohio is one of the states that has the worst polls in terms of recent elections, even worse than states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Ohio was more off in 2020 than Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, all three of these states. The next state is the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin went to Ron Johnson by 3.4%, despite New York Times having this race as a race that Democrats are expected to win in that column. And I think Ron Johnson will be able to win again, given that he is still a decent candidate, and that Wisconsin polls have really trended in his favor. Mandela Barnes was early on leading according to the polls, but even now the polls have Ron Johnson up by 4%. And just looking at these results here, Wisconsin, Ron Johnson is expected to win by 5% according to FiveThirtyEight. Again, a website that is biased towards the Democratic Party, thus I will have this race as a likely seat for Ron Johnson. Now going to the state of Pennsylvania. John Fetterman's enthusiasm is really going down. Pennsylvania at one point had a Fetterman lead of 12%, and it was narrowing down going to election day as around October 20th, Fetterman's lead really started to shrink. It was 4% around October 20th. Now Fetterman is only up by 0.3%. Remember, just about 1.5 months ago, or about 45 days ago, Fetterman had a lead of double digits. Now the lead has really shrunk, so Fetterman really has little to no chance. We know Republicans are getting underestimated in the Rust Belt. Potentially in other states, I do expect polls to also underestimate Republicans in other states, but particularly in the Rust Belt. Again, not a good thing for the Democratic Party, and Oz has been leading more polls recently than Fetterman. Again, a bad thing for the Democratic Party. Thus, I will have to put this race in the lean Democratic column. Now going to the state of New Hampshire. New Hampshire previously went to Maggie Hassan by 0.1%. Kelly Ayotte was a very good candidate on the Republican side, and she only lost by just over 1,000 votes. This election is also pretty competitive in the state of New Hampshire. Though FiveThirtyEight gives Hassan a 4% advantage, this race is definitely definitely closer to a coin flip. Donald Bodak has about a 27% chance according to FiveThirtyEight. However, I think his chance is definitely higher than that, given that in polling in the state of New Hampshire again, Hassan was leading by 8% against Donald Bodak at one point in time. In one point in time, I meant just about 15 days ago. Now, Hassan is only up by 2.8% according to polls, which are likely going to overestimate Hassan again. However, I do think that Hassan will be able to win, given that New Hampshire is still a state that, although very competitive every single election, does typically vote for Democrats, unless the environment is super unfavorable for them. Thus, New Hampshire is a tilt seat for the Democratic Party. Why did I leave out Georgia? Well, Georgia has this rule that a candidate needs to reach 50% for a race to not go to a runoff. A runoff is basically when two candidates face off against each other, except that day is set for a later date than election day, assuming no candidate reaches more than 50% of the votes. I do not expect either candidate to reach over 50% of the vote. Going to the 538 forecast, in the first round, Herschel Walker is expected to win 49.5% of the vote. Democratic incumbent Raphael Warnock is expected to win around 49%, and Chase Oliver, the independent, is likely to take around 2% of the votes. What does that actually mean in context? That means that no candidate will reach 50% of the vote. I think Herschel Walker will get around 49.8%, just shy of that 50% barrier. And thus this race may very well go to a runoff. If this race goes to a runoff, it will not look good for Raphael Warnock. As I previously expected, the Senate by then would already be 52 to 47 in favor of the Republican Party. Thus, this race doesn't really matter for Democrats, as Democrats are not going to get much done, given that Republicans already have 52 seats leading up to that Senate election. Thus, the Senate election wouldn't be that focused on. Thus, turnout will be lower, and when turnout is lower, Republicans consistently do better. Thus, I will give this race a lean characterization to the Republican Party. In the first round, we don't really know. Raphael Warnock could actually come up on top. But in the end, if this race goes to runoff, it doesn't matter. Republicans will likely win this seat. Anyways, thank you for watching today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. This video is relatively longer because there's much more information to cover, as we are just 5 days away from the election. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day. Bye!